Joe Pegleg Morgan was never supposed to belong. In a world built on bloodlines, barrio loyalty, and ethnic identity, Morgan stood out as an anomaly, a white man embedded deep within the Mexican Mafia, a prison gang forged in brutality and cultural cohesion. Yet it was precisely this contradiction that made him so dangerous. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, La M was still largely a localized prison power, feared behind walls but limited beyond them. Morgan saw something different. Where others saw survival, he saw empire. Where others saw prison yards, he saw streets, neighborhoods, and international pipelines. From the moment he aligned himself with La M, Morgan began reshaping it, not through charisma alone, but through calculated fear and absolute resolve. Morgan's rise was not fueled by emotion or impulsive rage. It was built on discipline, strategy, and an unflinching willingness to slay anyone who threatened the structure he envisioned. His physical disability, the missing leg that earned him the nickname Pegleg, became part of his mythology rather than a limitation. It signaled survival, resilience, and menace. Inside La M, Morgan climbed steadily, earning trust not through heritage but through results. He understood hierarchy, obedience, and consequence better than most. Over time, his influence hardened into authority, and his authority into near absolute control. By the early 1970s, Joe Morgan was no longer an outsider. He was a Godfather figure, quietly steering La M towards something far more powerful and far more lethal than it had ever been before. The year 1971 marked a decisive rupture in the history of the Mexican Mafia. Until then, violence had largely been contained within prison walls, controlled, targeted, and hidden from public view. Joe Morgan shattered that boundary with a single act of calculated slaughter. The victim was Alfonso Pachi Alvarez, a fellow member of La M. His offense was not personal betrayal alone, but symbolic defiance. Morgan understood that internal discipline was the backbone of organized crime, and discipline required fear that traveled farther than whispers in a cell block. Alvarez's execution was carried out on the street, in the open, sending a message that could not be ignored. This was not an impulsive act of rage. It was a declaration of doctrine. By ordering and participating in the street execution of a fellow gang member, Morgan rewrote the rules of enforcement. Loyalty was no longer enforced solely behind bars. It was now governed in the community, where families lived, where witnesses watched, and where law enforcement took notice. The homicide sent shockwaves through La M's ranks. It announced that Morgan was willing to bring prison justice into public space, collapsing the separation between incarceration and freedom. From that moment forward, membership in the Mexican Mafia carried a new and terrifying implication. Escape from prison did not mean escape from consequence. The execution of Pachi Alvarez became a template. It normalized street-level slaughter as a method of control, ensuring obedience through visibility. Morgan's reputation hardened overnight. He was no longer just a strategist or organizer. He was an enforcer willing to cross lines no one had dared cross before. The streets of California had become an extension of the prison yard, and La M's violence now moved freely between both worlds. Law enforcement would later identify this moment as the beginning of the Mexican Mafia's transformation into a full-spectrum criminal syndicate. But by then, the damage was already done. With fear established as policy, Joe Morgan turned his attention to profit. Violence was never the end goal. It was the tool that allowed everything else to function. Morgan understood that real power did not come from reputation alone, but from money, logistics, and supply. Using his connections beyond U.S. borders, he forged relationships with drug suppliers in Mexico, laying the foundation for large-scale heroin and cocaine distribution throughout California. This was not street-level dealing. It was infrastructure. Routes, intermediaries, protection networks, and enforcement arms were all carefully aligned under Laem's authority. Under Morgan's leadership, the Mexican Mafia evolved into a disciplined, hierarchical organization capable of coordinating narcotics operations across cities and counties. Prisons became command centers rather than limitations. Orders moved outward, carried by loyal soldiers who understood that failure meant certain slaughter. Morgan's vision was not chaos. It was control. Every dollar generated strengthened the organization, and every act of violence reinforced compliance. At his side stood his protege, Rodolfo Cheyenne Cadena, a man who would later become infamous in his own right. Together, they refined Laem's operational reach, blending street power with institutional manipulation. Perhaps the most insidious element of Morgan's strategy was the infiltration of taxpayer-funded drug treatment and community programs in East Los Angeles. These organizations, designed to rehabilitate addicts and stabilize neighborhoods, were quietly repurposed as financial pipelines. Funds were skimmed, positions were exploited, and the appearance of legitimacy shielded criminal activity from scrutiny. These programs became laundering mechanisms, not just for money, but for influence. The irony was devastating. Institutions meant to heal communities were now financing the syndicate that was poisoning them. Morgan understood that the safest place to hide a criminal enterprise was inside a respected institution. And for a time, it worked. Power invites scrutiny, and scrutiny invites danger. By the mid-1970s, cracks began to form in the facade Morgan had constructed. Ellen Delia, a founder of one of the infiltrated community programs, began to uncover the truth. She saw the financial irregularities, the intimidation, the quiet presence of organized crime where help was supposed to exist. More dangerously, she intended to expose it. For Joe Morgan, this was not merely a threat, it was an existential risk. Exposure would unravel the systems he had built, jeopardize revenue streams, and invite law enforcement directly into Laem's hidden corridors. In 1977, Ellen Delia was slain. Her homicide was not random, nor was it symbolic. It was precise, intentional, and instructive. The message was unmistakable. Silence was mandatory. Anyone who attempted to expose the Mexican Mafia's operations, whether gang member, civilian, or community leader, would be erased. The slaughter of Delia sent a chilling wave through East Los Angeles. Program staff backed away. Questions stopped being asked. Fear filled the vacuum where accountability should have existed. Morgan had once again demonstrated that no space was beyond Laem's reach. Not prisons, not streets, not even institutions designed to serve the public good. Joe Pegleg Morgan's legacy is not measured solely in bodies or drug shipments, but in transformation. He took a localized prison gang and forged it into a transnational criminal syndicate. He introduced street executions as doctrine, normalized homicide as organizational policy, and fused violence with business in a way that permanently altered American organized crime. Morgan proved that power could be wielded quietly, efficiently, and without hesitation. Long after his direct control faded, the systems he built remained. And in the shadows of prisons and neighborhoods alike, the echoes of his methods continue to resonate. A reminder that the most dangerous figures are not those who act in rage, but those who plan in silence.